Pariegak Yev Pari Irigun Ser Polorit. Welcome and good evening, everyone. My name is Masis Parunian, and I am this year's Vice Chair of the TCA Greater Boston Chapter. On behalf of all of us at TCA Boston, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's talk. Tonight, we're so lucky to be joined by two wonderfully knowledgeable and talented individuals for a very exciting and engaging talk on the topic of preserving an Armenian culture of stone masonry. In just a few moments, you'll hear from our moderator, Theodore Tolucan, a Boston architect, as well as our main speaker, Armenian architectural designer and researcher, Nare Filiposyan. I just wanted to take a moment to draw your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the talk, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. But if you have questions at any time during the presentation, feel free to go ahead and type those in that Q&A section, and we will answer them at the end. So a little background on the TCA. The Tekeyan Cultural Association is a not-for-profit organization whose mission is the preservation of Armenian culture and heritage in the diaspora, and to promote cultural, spiritual, and educational ties with the homeland, irrespective of political and ideological barriers. The Greater Boston chapter was recently reconstituted in 2019, and it's one of several chapters across North America, Europe, the Middle East, and Armenia. Our chapter is looking for new members of all ages, and we welcome new ideas from the community. So if you enjoy today's talk, please consider joining our mailing list. For more information about the Boston chapter, please email us at bostontca@gmail.com. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's moderator, Theodore Tolucan. Ted is a second-generation Armenian American whose grandparents immigrated from Turkey at the end of the genocide. He earned his bachelor's degree in architecture from Lehigh University, and after a year of study at the Technical University in Vienna, he earned his master's in architecture from the University of Michigan. He is an architect, owner, and founder of Tolucan Inc. in Boston, where for nearly the past 2 decades, he has overseen the design and technical direction for a wide range of public, private, and institutional projects. His firm has received numerous awards, including recognition by Architecture Magazine as one of the top 50 firms in the nation from 2016 through 2019, as well as the Architecture Master Prizes 2019 Small Firm of the Year Award in Multidisciplinary Architecture. Please, everyone, give a warm virtual welcome to Ted Tolucan.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Masis, for the introduction, and also to Aram Arkun for organizing this exciting event. I would also like to extend a special thank you to the Tekeyan Cultural Association and to its support to preserve our Armenian culture and heritage. We would all be at a loss without the tremendous contributions that you provide to our community. This evening, I have the pleasure of being the moderator for a very interesting talk by Nara Filiposyan. Nara is born in Sisian, Armenia, and is very recently, I might add, a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a master's degree in architecture. So a special congratulations to Nara as well. While attending MIT, she was quite active. She also served as the co-president of the Architecture Student Association and was an executive member of the MIT NOMAS chapter. She has previously received scholarships to attend the United World College of the Adriatic, where she represented Armenia among 90 other nations. And prior to MIT, she received a bachelor's degree in philosophy and architecture from Bennington College, where she also served as a trustee member. Her professional experience spans working really for some of the top architecture firms and institutions in the field, holding multiple design and research positions at Shop Architects, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, just to name a few. She is an architectural designer and a researcher, and tonight we'll hear about her work and journey that focuses on the preservation of Armenian architectural techniques. Her talk, titled Return to Stone, Preserving a Culture of Stone Masonry, will explore the ancient stone masonry techniques practiced by Masons in Armenia that in turn produce a rich heritage of religious architecture that is so distinctly recognizable today. Her research spans interviews in Armenia, visits to medieval churches, quarries, and stone cutting facilities, and remote conversations with stone masons, and her own experiments as a way to understand the techniques at play that ultimately project a method for preserving the dying culture of Armenian stone masonry in her own work. And this is the bridge between the past and the future of this craft that marks Nare not only as a historian, but also as an innovator seeking new ways to move the tradition of Armenian masonry craft into the next generation. So everyone, please welcome Nare Filiposyan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the generous introduction. All right, everyone can see, great. Thank you. Thanks again for the introduction, and my special thanks to the, apologies. Sorry about that. All right, take two. All right. Thank you for the generous introduction, and my special thanks to the Tekeyan Cultural Association of Boston for the invitation and for organizing this event. I'm honored to be here virtually and to share my work with you today, which is really a work in progress that started as a Master's of Architecture thesis at MIT. What follows is a cultural inquiry mediated through conversations with Masons. It is also a personal journey from Western academia to my hometown, searching for a language to understand, in architectural terms, the many stone playgrounds of my childhood. In contemporary Armenia, stone is ubiquitous. From street furniture to thousands of public water fountains, from houses passed down through generations, from municipal buildings to Soviet housing blocks disguised under stone tiles, to thousands of medieval churches. Stone is a vital part of the cultural fabric, holding both physical as well as intangible cultural heritage. Though the appearance of stone is pervasive, concrete has largely replaced stone as a structural material, reducing it to veneer surfaces while still tasked with carrying an enormous cultural load. As a result, certain stonework techniques are dying out. During a period described as the Dark Age for the Byzantine Empire, Armenian Masons developed advanced stonework techniques at a time when brick and concrete had replaced stone masonry across the region. Between the 4th and 13th centuries, Armenian Masons produced a rich heritage of religious architecture, much of which still stands today. In the more recent history of Armenia, the Soviet era, many of the buildings were built with concrete and stone veneer, highlighting the cultural importance of stone. In this culture of stone, where you would build a house for your grandchildren and a church for centuries, stone had embodied the material properties that would enable a lasting architecture. When prefabricated concrete panels were introduced, the impulse was to clad it with stone, if only to preserve the cultural imaginary of things being made out of stone. This insistence on stone veneer was a way of resisting a modernist imposition and reincorporating stone even when it was structurally unnecessary. These buildings demonstrate the cultural impulse and resistance to the complete replacement of stone, as well as the strategy of survival. It is during this period when a local building craft that had been tested throughout centuries slowly gave way to the dominance of concrete. The literature on medieval Armenian architecture focuses on plan typologies and formal descriptions and comparisons of various churches and monasteries. What is not discussed is what it takes to produce those forms. What kind of work does it take to build these spaces? What kind of skill and technique is required to cut a block of stone in a certain way? What is the method of assembly of given elements? What does it take to sustain that knowledge? In other words, what has been overlooked is the underlying building craft, specific knowledge embodied by masons that has enabled the existence of that architecture. With only a handful of masons that hold this knowledge, the disappearance of embodied techniques of stone masonry are at stake. The research underlying this thesis was an attempt to understand an existing culture of stone. It involved interviews in Armenia with masons, visits to medieval churches, quarries, stone cutting facilities, followed by remote conversations and my own experiments as a way to understand the techniques at play. The research is the basis for the proposition that I'm making for returning to stone. To give you a glimpse, I'll share a 3-minute film of an extended conversation that I've been having with a mason. And if you speak Armenian, you will catch moments of frustration in his voice when I ask questions that clearly show a lack of an embodied understanding.
Բարի օր Վարպետան ջան, իք մատ հարց ունեմ։ Մոտավորապես ինչքան է հարաբերությունը կոպտատաշ ու սրբատաշ մասի։ Նկատի ունեմ ես 5 սանտիմետր հերիք է, որ քարը դեպի ներս չընկնի։ Լավ։ Ինչ որ հատուկ ձև է տաշած պոչ քարը, թե ուղակի քարի կտորը։
Ուղակի քարի կտորը տակը դնելու համար, վերջ։
Խորշի անկյունի քարը մի կտորից է տաշվում։
Մի կտորով տաշել չի լինի այդ քարը, երկու հատով պետք է լինի։ Այդ կտորը որ կա դուրս է հելած, դա մնում է շաղախի մեջ, որպես կապ, մեկը մյուսին։ Չէ, նորմալ է։ Ուղղակի պետք է տեսնես, թե ոնց է տաշվում քարը, տեղում ամեն ինչ նկատես, որ հասկանաս, թե այդ քարը կդրվի պատին, թե չի դրվի, թե չէ գծելով բան դուրս չի գա։ Խորշի կամարը, որ նկարել ես, 6 քարով չի լինում, կամ 7 է լինում, 9, 5, կենտով է լինում, սխալ է ես նկարածդ։ Այսինքն կենտ քարը մեջտեղը պետք է լինի, մնացածը կողքերը, որպեսզի կամարը ստացվի։
Լավ, հասկացա։ Ես ուղակի Սիսիանի կամարներից մեկին էի նայում, դրա համար էի զույգ քարերով գծել։
Այ եթե ուշադիր նայես կամարը, այն մեջտեղը վերևի մասը, Զամոգ դրել են, բայց փոքր է։ Ձեռքները ինչ պատահ է, այդ քարը շարել են, բայց զամոկ ունի ինքը։ 25 սանտիմով զամոկը։ Ճիշտը սա է, այսպես պետք է լինի կամարը։
Through the process of making models or modeling this process, I attempted to produce an embodied account of the techniques at play. What becomes evident in this exchange is the difference between theoretical and embodied knowledge. It is the difference between knowing whether the crevice of the squinch can be built with a single piece of stone or not. The mason is giving me a piece of theoretical knowledge in the drawing form, which I am enacting in order to acquire an embodied understanding. This image of masons drawing on stone, with stone, about stone, highlights the fact that embodied techniques that they hold cannot be abstracted into architectural drawings and are attained with stone and through stone. So by focusing on the embodied knowledge of the masons who have produced this architecture, I suggest deprivileging architectural objects and seeing it as the outcome of the work of the masons. Currently, there are 3 strands of stonework in Armenia. A method called Medis, dating back to the 4th century. In this method, 2 layers of dressed stone are filled with lime mortar and rubble stone to create a structural wall. The stone acts as a false formwork during construction. Once complete, it protects the middle layer from the elements, making it a long-lasting system. Most buildings prior to the Soviet era are built with the Medis technique. However, this method of building is dying out, and there are only a handful of masons that hold this knowledge. Then there is the industrial method, wherein poured concrete or CMU blocks are clad with thin stone tiles. Driven by efficiency and standardization, this has become the dominant way of building in Armenia today. In this economy of stone, value is driven from the thinness of stone, which no longer has a structural role. The thinner the stone, the higher the profit margin. This tendency to think of value only through financial terms comes at the expense of cultural values, such as building a house that will last for multiple generations. And in between these 2 types of stonework, there is ornamental stone carving. So we can understand this culture of stone as a matrix of 3 distinct types of masons who embody 3 distinct relationships between stone and architecture. The culture of stone is also a culture of language. Someone who restores medieval churches built with the Medis technique is called a batshar. An ornamental stone carver is called a kardash. A mason working with the industrial method and installing stone tiles is called a shinara. Instead of reinforcing existing hierarchies of master masons versus construction workers, skilled versus unskilled laborers, I see the distinct types of masons as equal players in this culture of stone. So if the setting of my work is the embodied knowledge of stonemasonry with all of its strands, the ambition here is to perpetuate a culture of stone by producing architecture that necessitates the dying methods of stonework and reprioritizes the knowledge of the masons that have been rendered obsolete as a byproduct of standardization. One of those masons, whose knowledge is at stake, Varpet Andranik, who has just retired after 3 decades of restoring churches and monasteries across Armenia, has been a patient and generous guide in my pursuits. I met Varpet Anjanik during the summer of 2021 and have been having sustained conversations since then. I'm immensely grateful to him for sharing his love and knowledge of working with stone. And every piece of wisdom in sketch or audio form that gave a backbone to my research. When I visited him at his apartment in Yerevan, which of course had an intricately carved stone entrance inside a multi-story apartment building, he said something that highlights the difference between the two methods of working with stone, the Medis that is dying out and the dominant industrial method. When I asked him how the nature of the work changes, depending on whether he's restoring an old church or working on cladding, this is what he said. You see, when you're cladding, it's like eating borscht every single day. Whereas here, today you're eating a meat soup, the next day is borscht, and the other day might be a different soup. It's interesting. You don't get tired while working. You're thinking the whole time and it all comes together gradually. Suddenly you realize that you're done, not noticing how the time went by. When you're cladding, you do the same thing 50 times trying to do your 40 square meters per day so you can get paid. Here, it's interesting. I'm impatient to get to the next place and figure out how it's going to work. Then you look and you have placed the keystone. That's where the beauty lies in restoring an old church. In new construction, you know what's ahead of you. In the old one, when you find a piece of stone, locate its original place, and use that piece to figure out other relationships, your interest keeps growing, like solving a puzzle. Especially when you find a piece that's maybe half broken and you have to restore it, place it in its original location, make it beautiful while preserving the old, it makes you feel good because you're appreciating the sweat that this other person has put into the stone before you. There is no need to discard all of that. That's the main difference. The characteristics of the resulting architecture, which many of you are likely familiar with, is directly linked to the techniques of stonework enacted by the Masons. This Medis technique of stone masonry, which consists of 2 layers of dressed stone sandwiched with mortar and rubble, allowed the Masons to render interior and exterior surfaces independent from each other. The formal language is the direct result of the logic of the technique itself. To understand the relationship between the technique and its spatial and architectural implications, I studied one of the oldest standing examples of this stonework, the Church of Saint Hovannes, located in Sisian, built in the late 6th century. Typical of all structures built with this technique, the interior articulations of Saint Hovannes are disguised under uniform and monolithic surfaces of the exterior. A rectangular contour masks circular, semicircular, polygonal, and more complex forms. The only elements that reveal interior transitions are the squinches, which are triangular, half-conic niches carved from the outside of the wall. This is a key element that appears in many of the medieval stone buildings. It acts as a way of corrugating and strengthening the wall, as well as a method for reducing the overall volume of materials, while other times it is transferring loads from the dome to the foundations. To create a dome on top of a square plan, several geometric techniques are used to facilitate the translations of form and load. In this case, there are 4 squinches around the corners of the square plan. The squinches then support an 8-sided prism, which is nested inside a 12-sided prism from the outside. The dome is spherical on the interior and conical on the exterior. What I'm describing here is ingenuity and playfulness in form that is directly resulting from the building technique. Those are geometric games that the masons can play with stone using the Medice technique, which then results in a monumental piece of architecture. During my research in Armenia, I gathered different representations of stone. Some of those representations are architects' drawings. Others are adaptations of those by the masons. They all exist with some level of inaccuracy in relationship to reality. Another representation of stone is a digital reconstruction of Saint Hovhannes that I produced using a series of photographs. Just like the architect's drawings, the digital model is attempting to get close to the stone, yet remaining inaccurate in its own way. What the digital model enables is the legibility of the seams of individual blocks, which then begin to reveal the work of the masons, but only to an extent. The surface fails to convey how a given block of stone was carved, shaped, lifted, held in place, or how it is linked to the inner rubble layer of the wall. What I've tried to convey so far is that in order for a building craft to exist, it needs to be practiced. The knowledge that the masons hold, their embodied knowledge, that is, cannot be preserved by simply writing it down or by drawing it. What I'll share next is a speculative project where stone is reintroduced into the contemporary context in new forms and relationships in order to preserve and advance the disappearing building craft. The techniques that are dying out are inherently monumental. The scale of a single block of stone, the proportion of a squinch, such as this one, relative to the human body, the physical labor, knowledge, and skills required to manipulate a heavy material like stone into this form. Those are stone constructions that embody monumentality in the civic sphere. What I'm proposing is an architecture that consists of monuments, with domesticity embedded in them, that together produce a house along a street in a town. The monuments are exaggerations, cognizant of the domestic scale. The outcome is a new unit of construction, which isn't the block of stone, but the monumental element that can produce architecture for various needs. Those monuments are units of possibilities. What you're seeing here is a new architectural language derived from that same squinch from the Church of Saint Hovhannes. The typical elements of medieval Armenian architecture are being reconfigured into new relationships, resulting in architecture that can be inhabited at a domestic scale while preserving the monumental scale of the technique itself. Situated in my hometown of Sisyan in southern Armenia, the project spans the ambiguous seam between the civic and the domestic spheres of my grandmother's house, street, and neighborhood. How do we carry things forward, but also look back? How do we carry things into the future that are not nostalgic and regressive, but allow for adaptations and changes? Rather than being nostalgic, in the process of this work, I've been concerned with recognizing the potential of the Medice technique, as well as its limits, and finding ways to advance it in order to perpetuate the knowledge of the Masons. I've chosen my grandmother's house and the street and neighborhood as the site of the project because, similarly to the dyeing technique of stonework, the house requires an accommodation of the past and the future. The flower garden and the northern facade of the house are street facing, physically as well as programmatically, blurring the edge between what is private and public. The house is located between two terraced gardens, the flower garden below the street level, which then leads you down to the house, which in turn leads you out into the vast garden. The canal, which is used for irrigation, collects underground water and runs through everyone's gardens, creating unwritten rules about who waters their gardens when. In this project, I'm taking an infrastructural approach by designing the backbone and allowing the rest to be filled in over time, be partially demolished and adapted. The main elements are the street, the retaining walls with fountains embedded in them, the curb, the monuments that constitute the house, the canal that runs through everyone's gardens. They're placed in relationship to each other and are driven by the need to produce a private that is very much embedded in the public. In each of those areas, the monuments I have designed produce deliberate interactions between the collective and individual inhabitants and the techniques of stone building that produce this architecture. Each design intervention results in a singular monument that synthesizes multiple forces where stone is simultaneously a cultural, structural, spatial, and a thermal condition. Let's begin in the garden with an element that stands above the shared canal. The canal is an infrastructure that, while physically being in the private sphere, is inherently communal, enabling the movement of water from one property to the other. The monument above the canal marks a grand gesture as you ascend from the house into the vast garden. On a hot summer day, you can sit in the sheltered space underneath the squinch and dip your feet into the cool water as you help yourself to raspberries, which in turn benefit from being near the canal for the higher moisture in the soil. If we move back to the house, we encounter another monument, the living room. This monument is exploring the potential of stone for inhabitation. The less massive, south-facing facade may become very warm, but that warmth would get absorbed at different rates into the deeper parts, creating different microclimates within the space. The outcome is monumentality and mass in appearance, yet differentiation in terms of comfort and domesticity. Adjacent is a monument where a bedroom is embedded in the second story. You walk through a widening hallway, take the stairs up, and arrive at the bedroom, which is at the top of the squinch. Through its design, this monument allows for the mason's technique to be perpetuated, but also it produces a new architecture that places the inhabitants in new relationships to those monumental stoneworks, such as being at the top of the squinch. In other words, what I'm trying to design is a way in which both the technique of the mason moves ahead of time and the awareness of that technique is made legible to its inhabitants. Leaving the house, we're in the street, where we can understand this project not as a tabula rasa replacement of the neighborhood, but a slow and incremental process, where the backbone of the community would be built first, and the rest can grow over time, be partially demolished, and adapted by the next generations. The construction of this retaining wall, which is a civic infrastructure, but designed with domestic sensibility of scale and attention to detail that allows the pedestrians to inhabit the street, would be enacted over time in order to perpetuate the activity of the masons. You see that the masons are building monuments along this wall in a strategic sequence that is scalable and can grow over time, move on to something else, and come back and modify it. Moving out again, we can see in this section that all of this is woven together. In this proposal, architecture participates in the reconstitution and perpetuation of a culture of stone. The domestic monuments are design innovations that can produce cultural continuity and maintain the existing possibilities. The outcome is a new cultural fabric of stone with moments of intensity and punctuation that runs all the way from the civic to the domestic, continues from the curb to the canal. What I've shared with you today is a cultural inquiry through the medium of architecture. It is ultimately a conversation. Therefore, the next step would be to return to the Masons. The provocation that I'm making here is to have an ongoing conversation between architecture as artifact and the embodied scales and techniques that produce that architecture.
All right. Thank you, Nare. That was amazing. On a number of levels. First off, I think that it's a tremendous amount of research that you went through, and it felt very deeply personal and professional in your journey. And before we get into some questions, I may just start it off and throw some out while people are putting questions into the chat. And aside from, I think, the research that you went through, what struck me the most is the exploration and the explanation around something that appears so formal to so many people. And the way you were able to uncover the object, translate the structural techniques, the discussions with the masonry, very much personalize something that seems very inanimate. And through that whole process, I was struck by the authenticity and the honesty in the structure. And this part, I think, is so hard to understand and explain. And what fascinates me the most about your work is not only your research as a historian, uncovering that authenticity, but really pulling that into another generation of work, which is how do we translate that and communicate it into a more contemporary era? And the question I have is, that's certainly a process that requires a lot of passion. And I wanted to get a sense from you, for everybody here, is what was the bridge for you between the joy of the past and the joy in your work that you see in the future?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a very good question and a very difficult one, for sure.
Do that so
I think the joy in kind of revisiting these places now that I've had a certain kind of training, right, as an architect, and I've been trained particularly in kind of Western academia, and to kind of revisit some of these places that I grew up around and places that I played around as a child, but I never really saw them as like architecture, capital A architecture, or I was never kind of taught about them as architecture. And so, but I kind of had I feel like I've been kind of chasing this lineage for a while. It's kind of now evolving into a body of work that I can kind of speaks directly from my heart and share publicly. But I think it's something that I've been really pursuing for a while. I think what kind of drives my passion now to continue this research, it's really a beginning for me, I think, is that dialogue that sustained dialogue that I had with Varpet Andrianik, who was incredibly patient with me, who would answer my WhatsApp calls and text messages and sketches with, I would ask a question and he would just send me a drawing that pretty much explained everything in that drawing. And to me, I think there is so much knowledge in someone like him that has years of experience, having worked with something that was built by many generations of Masons before him, who cares about restoring them and who cares about passing that knowledge. And that's kind of what drives my passion into finding ways to make demand for someone like Varpet Andrianik in the contemporary kind of building context of Armenia.
Interesting. So that leads me to some questions that are in the question and answer piece. And there's a number of very good questions, and I may just go not in any particular order, but building on this idea of these two eras and how they may be exclusive to one another. There's a question from Kavork that says something interesting about maybe the tension that exists between the two, and do they actually exist together? And he asks, thank you so much. When restoring historic monuments, are the original techniques employed exclusively, or are modern materials and techniques like reinforced concrete employed as well? So in a sense, do they ever mix these, or do they stay true to the composition that they were once made from?
That's a very good question. And I think it very much depends on who is restoring them. When I spoke with Varpet Andrianik, I didn't sense any kind of nostalgia on his part for doing things as they were done for the sake of, kind of preserving integrity in that sense. For example, he told me about window on the monastery of Datev that a former restoration had done it incorrectly. And he straight up was just like, that's just wrong. And I asked him how he defines that a restoration was done wrongly. And he said, because the water, the rain would like kind of drain into the inside of the church, and that the original Masons would never have done a mistake like that because they had so much experience doing that. And so he didn't care so much about undoing this, former step and rebuilding it another way. And so I sensed that sort of agency on the Masons' part to kind of interpret as they go. And similarly, in terms of the material use, I like asked about that as well. And previously, the rubble kind of mixture that was poured in the middle would have been lime mortar, which usually takes about 21 days to cure at the very least. And not to cure, but to get to a kind of dryness point that they can continue to build, further layers on top of the layer of stone. So they have started substituting, into the recipe of what they pour in the middle, adding some proportion of concrete, for example. Or they were proudly telling me how they figured out a way to build a dome without any scaffolding by using kind of like a rebar technique that they've sort of learned from each other and keep kind of passing it to, the other generations that doesn't, that you wouldn't have seen in the very kind of early churches, the use of rebar. Right. But that kind of allows them to like proudly build something that doesn't require kind of a secondary temporary, scaffolding.
No, I think your knowledge of technology is really impressive. And it's like you had a number of courses on ancient Armenian technology. And I think one of the pieces of that is the fascination with these churches, that they embody just this incredible durability over the years, that they've withstood earthquakes, they've withstood, all kinds of different types of attacks, etc. And I guess there's a couple questions in here around earthquakes, and, particularly I think around how they resist it, but also how, I'm going to take this question from Ida, who says, how are they I'm going to summarize this a little bit, to make these modern stone masonry buildings earthquake resistant? So thinking about what you were researching in your past with these historical churches, and this new embodiment that you're looking at in the next chapter, there are different technologies that you'd want to look at that would maybe create a new chapter in this Massis technique, that maybe a Mason from the medieval times would have said, no, that's perfect. That's exactly.
Yeah, I'll just say that I'm not a structural engineer. I'll start by saying that. And then I'll also say that the pure kind of evidence that despite many earthquakes, many of these, stonework constructions very much stand, like the one in Sisian that I shared. And that is because there are already at play various kind of methods of dealing with earthquakes, that the Masons are very much fluent in these techniques. For example, usually if you see a church that was hit by an earthquake, if most of the damage happens on the dome, and that is because the way that they set the kind of pillars of the dome, instead of kind of essentially gluing it to the lower levels, they would kind of set on dry stones, so that in case of an earthquake, the dome could kind of have a freedom to shift around a little bit. Or worst case scenario, the dome would topple the rest of the church standing in place. That's one example of kind of some of the techniques that are already at play. That being said, of course, Armenia is in a seismic zone, and I think that is a huge kind of factor. And I think moving forward, developing some sort of methodologies and working with, structural engineers with the knowledge, I think would be a critical, next step. But I think kind of, for me at least, not discounting the knowledge of these Masons is a big part, because unlike kind of the Western context, where there was a kind of master builder, typology at one point. Some of you might be familiar with the Guastavino company that built incredible kind of vaulted spaces all across the US. They were master builders, just like Varpet Anjanik. They had huge amount of agency on a building site. The architect wasn't the boss, so to speak. And then at one point, they were replaced by structural engineers, consultants, and then they kind of became decorators to some extent. And their techniques were questioned. Their kind of buildings were questioned, their methods, even though they had evidence to prove that what they built can stand on its own. So I think moving forward, while I think, looking into that more from a technical point of view is key, but I wouldn't discount some of the, embodied skills that they already hold in terms of dealing with earthquakes.
You're talking so much about this, I think, fascinating generational transit, of how you're passing this knowledge from generation to generation or century to century. And to the spirit of, the association here tonight and how we're preserving the cultural heritage and protecting it and communicating it. Think about food and how it passes between generations and, the concern that families have, even their own families and how this stands. You're putting a great lens on something that most people don't think about, the heritage of our buildings, of our legacy. And there's a question here from Zaven that says, did Varbed Antamnig teach younger apprentices his techniques, right? So is he keeping his torch the same way that you are right now? Are there a lot of, I love this part of his question, are there a lot of Varbeds still active in Armenia, or is this becoming a lost art?
Yeah, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of Varbeds like Anjanik who can practice that particular technique, which is how all the medieval monasteries were built. Varbet Anjanik has had, many generations of apprentices that he has taught, but unfortunately, there is very little demand for that type of building in Armenia. Even when new churches are being built, which has its own kind of, politics and history, it's usually done by like oligarchs that want to place their name on kind of a monumental structure. They're actually built with concrete and then they're clad with stone. So they're kind of like copying the image of the old church, but they're building it with a method that makes the Varbeds pretty much obsolete. And they're kind of like eliminating the need for that knowledge, which is why I've become interested in the subject, because it is knowledge that unfortunately, which I hopefully, conveyed, you can't teach that to someone without them themselves practicing it. And that's kind of why I've become interested in the particular kind of technique itself.
Yeah, one of the other things that I was listening to your talk, and I think there was a word you used, which was simultaneous aspects around this construction, which was at one hand cultural, another hand structural, spatial, and thermal. And it really isolates like the masonry itself. And I'm looking at a question here from Tanya. And she's reaching into another aspect, thinking about what else went into these beautiful churches, the frescoes, the painting, the other craftsmanship. What kind of simultaneity existed between these other crafts? And her question really talks about the connection between the aliveness and the embodiment of the art. And I'm going to probably just put a broader sort of stroke on what that means, the art, which is the encompassing of all of these crafts together. How did they coexist? How did they all work together and make this, were they talking? Were they speaking with each other, or were they just in sync, simpatico, to some extent?
Yeah, for sure. That's a very good question. And I will also say I'm not an art historian. So that is not something that I have personally researched very much about. But of course, I like briefly mentioned kind of like ornamental carving, right? There's plenty of those in every single kind of, church or monastery you look at. Part of the reason why I didn't put so much emphasis in my research on that is because, many of you will be familiar with the art of cross stone carving or khachkars. That is very much a very alive and active kind of building technique a craft essentially, an art form that exists in Armenia. So a lot of the times while, the Padshahs or the wall builders like Varpet Anjanik would be, doing the kind of building work. The ornamental carvers would be doing a lot of the decorative work, which you can see a lot of it even in the case of Saint Hovannes as well. But part of the reason why I didn't put so much emphasis on it is because one of those techniques is at the verge of disappearing. Hence my kind of focus on looking at it more closely.
Definitely. So I think we have a little bit more time. I'll probably just maybe pull a couple more questions, and I'm going to also just reach back to another piece that you brought up, which is how to carry. I particularly like this bridge that you're talking about between the past and the future. And it shows a lot of care and certainly respect, but also the responsibility that we have in our community to sort of hold these virtues so importantly in the next generation. I think you said something about being nostalgic, the Mason, not necessarily being nostalgic, realizing also the potential and the limits of the Madis techniques, so we can advance it into this newer period. And that to me says a lot about the responsibility. So what I guess I would say, where does that span for you? This sort of acknowledgement about the imperfection that actually is where I think a lot of beauty lies, and learning how to understand that so you can advance it.
Absolutely. One of the ways in which I was interested in kind of looking at the limits is the kind of thermal conditions. What does that mean to inhabit a room or a living room or a bedroom that's built with this technique, so that it's no longer a church, right? Like you're actually you're inhabiting this as a house. So like, what are the thermal kind of implications of that? So and it is, I was looking at it in the Armenian context, which of course has like, weather, harsh kind of climates as well, cold winters and warm summers, and kind of, insulation is a big part of, wanting a comfortable temperature, right? So one thing I looked at was having some aerated stone pockets. Essentially, I was trying to look at a way in which we could increase the insulating capacity of the Madis technique. So I tested a method where instead of using just like scrap rock pieces in the mortar, you could use aerated stones, which have pockets of air in them. And I ran some like thermal models to see what the effects are. And it's not insignificant, which suggested that there is a potential to look at the old structural system and then push it to satisfy contemporary needs of inhabitation in a domestic space.
No, that's an excellent point. And I think we may have a little bit more time. I'm going to read one more, Masis, and then turn it back to you. What do you say? Is that good? Okay. All right. So I think a lot of our conversation has been so specific to Armenian history. And there's a question here from Alan Gregorian, which I think is relatively important, right? Was this construction method specific to Armenia? Are there other countries and regions that are now using similar methods?
I think there's definitely many places in the world where you can find a version of what's called rubble wall masonry. What is very particular to Armenia is that at that period, the 4th and 5th century, the rest of the Byzantine Empire had gave up on stone. They were already building with much smaller pieces of building blocks. They were building with bricks. So what is particularly Armenian in this particular case is the kind of scale of the building blocks that at that time was kind of unheard of. And the Armenian Masons kind of kept advancing stone cutting techniques and stereotonomy, which is much later credited to the French, but was something that was being very much like advanced at much earlier period. But you can definitely see a similar version of a rubble wall masonry in other parts of certainly the Byzantine Empire, but beyond that as well.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think my time's up asking questions, so I'm going to pass this over to Masis, and I want to thank Nara very much for a really amazing talk and really enlightening and not just educational, but really inspiring. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the great conversation.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you so much, Nara. That was such a wonderful talk. I feel like I speak for everybody. I feel like I learned so much. I'm sure our audience learned so much, and that was really a very kind of energizing talk. So thank you so much for sharing all of your work with us today. I'd like to thank our audience also for being here with us this evening. And remember, if you'd like to learn more about our upcoming events, you can please email us at bostontca@gmail.com. With that, I'd like to thank our speakers one more time, as well as Aram Arkun, the Executive Director of the TCA United States and Canada branches, for his help in coordinating this evening, and our wonderful TCA Boston Committee for helping us put this event together. And finally, wish all of you a wonderful evening. Shunaragalutuniev, Parikisher.